The second phase of the war unfolded in a way that unsettled even human planners because it revealed how deeply their species had prepared for a moment they had hoped would never arrive. And while the compact mobilized massive armadas and displays meant to intimidate, humanity did not rush to meet them head-on, instead allowing the galaxy to watch as human space appeared almost empty, borders quiet. Planets darkened behind layered defense fields that did not flare or announce themselves, and this absence created a false confidence among alien admirals who believed they were witnessing a retreat. Yet within human command circles, Admiral Nguyen made it clear that this war would not be fought for spectacle but for outcome, and orders flowed outward not as grand speeches, but as precise tasking packets assigning roles to fleets, civilian networks, and even cultural institutions. Because humanity had learned long ago that war was not merely the clash of armies but the alignment of an entire society toward survival. And so while the compact fleets advanced, human diplomats quietly reappeared across neutral systems not to beg for aid but to deliver evidence, unedited records of the agricultural world's destruction, biometric data of civilian casualties, and transcripts of ignored warnings. And these were not framed as propaganda but as context, a simple statement of what had occurred and what would follow. And many neutral species recoiled not at the images themselves but at the human tone accompanying them, calm, factual, and utterly devoid of rage, which some found more frightening than any threat. And within weeks, trade lanes once loyal to the compact began to hesitate. Insurance guilds raised premiums on compact shipping, and entire logistics chains slowed as independent actors quietly disengaged. All while human strike groups moved invisibly through known space using routes that compact cartographers believed impossible, because humans had mapped gravity wells and subspace shear zones not as obstacles but as tools, and the first true counterblow landed not on a fleet but on the compact command structure itself when a synchronized information attack disrupted council communications for exactly 11 minutes, long enough for conflicting orders to be issued and acted upon, resulting in 3 compact task forces firing on each other in confusion. An event officially labeled a tragic accident, but privately understood as something far worse, and as the compact scrambled to reassert control, human marines conducted boarding actions with a discipline that stunned survivors, taking ships intact, disabling crews with non-lethal precision, and leaving behind data cores wiped except for a single repeating message stating that escalation pathways were being closed, not opened, a phrase analysts struggled to interpret until entire sectors found themselves effectively demilitarized without a single planetary invasion, and still humanity did not declare total war, because within human history there existed a deep fear of becoming what they fought, and debates raged across Earth and the colonies about limits, about proportionality, about whether restraint still had meaning when facing an enemy that had burned cities without warning. And it was during one such debate that a civilian voice broke through the noise, a teacher from the ruined agricultural world who addressed a global assembly and said that the war should be fought not to prove human superiority, but to ensure no other species would ever suffer what they had, and that statement was quietly adopted as doctrine, shaping subsequent operations toward protection rather than conquest. And so human fleet began escorting refugee convoy from non-human worlds caught between compact forces, offering sanctuary without demands, a move that baffled compact strategists who could not reconcile humanitarian action with effective warfare. Yet these rescues built a web of gratitude and allegiance that no treaty could replicate, and when a compact admiral finally attempted to force a decisive engagement near the Aelio's Rift, believing that destroying a human core fleet would break their momentum, he found instead that the humans had already anticipated the move, allowing his armada to enter the rift before collapsing the surrounding subspace gradients in a controlled manner that stranded the ships without fuel or communication, and rather than annihilate them, humanity offered terms, safe return in exchange for immediate ceasefire compliance, and when the admiral refused out of pride, the humans simply waited, providing supplies sufficient to keep the crews alive but powerless, a slow lesson in inevitability, and word of this spread faster than any official broadcast, eroding morale across compact space, because the galaxy was beginning to realize that humanity was not fighting to win battles but to redefine what war meant, and in the quiet moments between engagements, Admiral Nguyen reflected that this conflict was already shaping humanity's future identity, forging a collective resolve that balanced mercy with unyielding resolve. And she understood then that the war defining humanity would not be remembered for its greatest explosion or final treaty, but for the moment the species decided what kind of power it would choose to be. By the third year of the conflict, the galaxy had begun to fracture along lines no one had predicted, not between humans and the compact alone, but within the compact itself, because the pressure applied by humanity was not blunt force but sustained clarity, exposing every weakness in governance, every corruption hidden behind ceremonial unity. And worlds that had once relied on compact fleets of protection now questioned whether that protection had ever truly existed, while human intelligence, services, operating with uncomfortable transparency, released verified records showing how often compact patrols had abandoned peripheral systems to protect core interests, and these disclosures did not come with accusations but with timestamps, sensor data, and casualty figures that allowed each system to reach its own conclusions, and many did, choosing neutrality, autonomy, or quiet alignment with humanity, not out of fear but out of trust built through consistent action. And as this realignment spread, compact leadership grew increasingly desperate, authorizing measures that violated their own founding principles, including the deployment of subspace denial weapons that destabilized entire star systems, rendering them uninhabitable for generations. And when one such weapon was detonated near a mixed human and non-human colony cluster, killing billions and collapsing local space-time into a lethal storm, the last internal restraints within human command finally gave way. Because this act crossed a line older than any treaty, and Admiral Nguyen convened what would later be called the Final Council, not of politicians but of representatives from every major human institution, military, scientific, cultural, and civilian, and the decision reached was unanimous without celebration, that the compact capacity to wage war must be ended completely, not through annihilation of species, but through irreversible dismantling of their war-making structures, and the operation that followed was executed with a precision that bordered on the unreal, as human forces simultaneously neutralized shipyards, command nexuses, an industrial world across compact space using technologies that bent physics just far enough to remain survivable, inducing controlled singularities that consumed only targeted infrastructure while leaving planetary biospheres intact. And in system after system, compact fleets found themselves unable to launch, unable to communicate, unable even to comprehend how their most secure facilities had been breached without warning. And amid this collapse, individual stories emerged that later defined the war's human phase, like Lieutenant Amina Okafor, who disobeyed an order to withdraw long enough to evacuate an alien hospital under fire, dying in the process, or Dr. Thomas Velasquez, who stayed behind on a destabilizing station to manually guide 1 million refugees through an emergency gate knowing he would not survive the transit window. And these stories spread across species boundaries, reshaping how humanity would perceive not as conquerors but as a force bound by self-imposed obligation. And when at last a compact council chamber was breached not by soldiers but by human envoys escorted by neutral observers, they found the surviving councilors diminished, exhausted, and afraid. And their Admiral Nguyen delivered the shortest speech of her career, stating that the war would end immediately if and only if the compact dissolved its centralized military authority, dismantled its enforcement fleet, and submitted to an interspecies oversight framework that included humanity but was not dominated by it. And the silence that followed was heavy with the weight of inevitability, because every counselor knew there was no alternative left. And when the vote passed to accept the terms, the war ended not with cheers or surrender ceremonies, but with a quiet transmission sent across all known space stating simply that hostilities had ceased, and in the aftermath humanity did not claim territory or tribute, but withdrew its fleets to the edges of known space, turning inward to rebuild what had been lost and to honor the dead, while the galaxy struggled to process what had occurred, because the war that defined humanity had revealed a species that would endure unimaginable loss without surrender, wield overwhelming power without indulgence, and impose limits on itself even when none remained to oppose it. And in that understanding a new era began, uneasy and fragile, shaped by the knowledge that humanity was no longer an underestimated participant in galactic affairs but a defining constant, a reminder written into collective memory that some wars are fought not to dominate history but to ensure it does not repeat its worst mistakes.
The years immediately following the ceasefire were more destabilizing than the war itself because victory had removed the one force holding countless systems in uneasy alignment, and while humanity withdrew its fleets as promised, the vacuum left behind exposed long-suppressed rivalries, economic dependencies, and cultural resentments that the compact had papered over with authority rather than resolved. And human analysts predicted this outcome with uncomfortable accuracy, prompting debates. within Earth's leadership about whether withdrawal had been a moral necessity or a strategic error, yet Admiral Nguyen remained firm that humanity could not become the new enforcer of the galaxy without betraying the very principles that had guided the war, and so instead of fleets humanity sent advisors, engineers, mediators, and archivists, people trained not in command but in repair, and these individuals entered fractured regions offering assistance without mandates, rebuilding trade, infrastructure, restoring communication networks, and helping newly independent systems draft agreements that reflected their own values rather than inherited doctrine, a process that was slow and often resisted, because many species still viewed humans through the lens of overwhelming force rather than quiet persistence, and it was during this fragile period that the remnants of the Compact attempted one final act of defiance, a covert coalition of former admirals and industrial magnates who believed that humanity's restraint was temporary weakness and that a decisive strike could fracture its internal unity, and their plan was not invasion but revelation, the release of stolen human archives intended to expose classified technologies and internal disagreements in hopes of sowing fear among allies and panic among civilians. Yet when the data was released it did not produce the chaos they expected, because humanity chose transparency over denial, publicly acknowledging the documents, contextualizing them, and allowing open debate across every human world, a response that stunned observers who had never seen a species willingly air its own fractures in the aftermath of war, and rather than weaken humanity, this openness strengthened its relationships, as allied species recognized a pattern they had witnessed throughout the conflict, that humans trusted process and accountability more than image. And when the conspirators attempted to escalate by sabotaging a joint reconstruction project on a non-human world, killing thousands, the response was swift but contained, a multinational task force led by humans but composed primarily of non-human security forces apprehended the perpetrators, placing them on trial before an interspecies tribunal rather than executing them, a deliberate choice that marked a turning point in galactic culture, because it demonstrated that the rule of law could exist beyond imperial force, and as the trials unfolded the galaxy learned more about humanity not from battlefield reports but from testimony, from historians explaining ancient wars that had nearly destroyed Earth, from survivors describing how close humanity had come to extinction by its own hand, and from philosophers articulating why restraint was not weakness but memory, and this collective narrative began to reshape education across dozens of systems, integrating the war not as a tale of human dominance but as a case study in consequence, and within humanity itself. The war left deep scars, entire generations shaped by loss and service, veterans struggling to reconcile pride with grief, civilians grappling with the knowledge of what their species was capable of, and it was here that the phrase "the war that defined humanity" gained its true meaning, because it was no longer about how others saw humans but how humans saw themselves. A species that had crossed a threshold and chosen not to step fully into the role it could so easily claim, and as new generations looked outward they did so with a caution born of hard experience, understanding that the galaxy would never again be a place where humanity could be ignored, but also that power without purpose would eventually demand a cost too high to pay, and so the era that followed was not one of peace guaranteed but of vigilance maintained, a living acknowledgement that the defining war had ended but its lessons would shape every human decision among the stars.
As the fifth phase of humanity's post-war era unfolded, it became clear that the consequences of the conflict were no longer primarily external but internal, both for humans and for the galaxy that now orbited their influence, because while borders had stabilized and open warfare had ceased, the psychological aftershocks continued to ripple through every system touched by the war. And nowhere was this more evident than in the emergence of younger species who had grown up watching humanity not as myth or rumor but as lived reality. Fleets that appeared without warning, battles that ended without conquest, and decisions that prioritized restraint over annihilation. And these species began to model their own doctrines after what they believed humanity represented, sometimes misunderstanding the lessons entirely, leading to a dangerous trend of smaller powers attempting preemptive deterrent strategies they were not equipped to control, prompting humanity to intervene diplomatically with a firmness that surprised those who assumed humans would remain passive indefinitely, and in one such incident a regional alliance attempted to justify a mass weapons deployment by citing human precedent, only to be met by Ambassador Lena Ortiz, who stated plainly that the precedent they were invoking was born from survival, not ambition, and that imitation without context was more dangerous than ignorance. a statement later circulated widely as a corrective to what scholars began calling the mythologizing of humanity, and within human space a parallel reckoning was taking place as veterans returned to civilian life carrying memories that did not fade with medals or public ceremonies, and governments invested heavily in long-term care not out of charity but recognition that the war had demanded too much to be forgotten quickly. And it was during this period that historians finally gained access to sealed wartime archives, revealing how close humanity had come to internal fracture. During the darkest moments, how narrow the margins had been between restraint and total escalation, and these revelations were taught openly rather than hidden, reinforcing a cultural norm that strength came not from pretending unity was effortless, but from acknowledging how hard it was to maintain, and this openness created a subtle but profound shift in galactic perception. Because species accustomed to sanitized historical narratives struggled to understand a civilization willing to expose its own near failures. Yet over time, this honesty built a deeper credibility than any display of force, and when a distant exogalactic probe entered known space bearing evidence of an expansionist civilization moving slowly but relentlessly toward the galactic rim, it was humanity that most species turned to not as conquerors but as interpreters of risk, and humanity responded not with alarm but with analysis, assembling a coalition of scientists, strategists, and philosophers to assess not only the threat but the ethical implications of preemptive action, a process that frustrated those who wanted immediate assurances of protection, yet it echoed the same pattern that had defined the war itself: deliberate, inclusive, and grounded in memory. And Admiral Nguyen, now long retired but still consulted, offered a final advisory message stating that the defining feature of the last war was not who humanity defeated but what it refused to become, and that any future conflict would test that definition again. And as a word circulated, humanity collectively understood that the war which had defined them was not a closed chapter but a reference point, a measure against which all future choices would be weighed. And in that understanding, the galaxies slowly came to accept a new reality, that humanity's greatest weapon was not its fleets or technologies, but its refusal to forget the cost of using them. A lesson hard won and carefully guarded as the stars watched and waited. The sixth movement of the story unfolded not with invasion fleets or emergency councils, but with a quiet realization spreading through both human and alien populations that the stability they were experiencing was provisional, maintained not by treaties alone but by continued choice. And this awareness became sharper as the extragalactic presence first detected years earlier finally made itself undeniable. Its probes no longer passive observers, but active surveyors dismantling uninhabited systems of mechanical indifference, harvesting matter and energy in ways that suggested a civilization optimized for expansion rather than coexistence. And unlike the compact, this new force did not communicate, did not posture, and did not appear to recognize sovereignty at all, a fact that unsettled humanity more than overt hostility ever could, because there was no room for deterrence without shared assumptions. And so humanity again found itself at the center of galactic deliberation, not by assertion but by expectation, as dozens of species requested guidance, coordination, or outright leadership. And this time the debate within human space was more intense than during the compact war, because the enemy ahead did not fit the moral frameworks that had guided restraint. And younger generations who had not lived through the defining war questioned whether patience and transparency would matter to an adversary incapable of understanding them, while veterans warned against assuming inevitability as an excuse for abandoning principle. And amid this tension, humanity chose a path that surprised even its allies, initiating direct contact attempts not through diplomats or warships, but through shared scientific language, broadcasting mathematical constants, physical models, and records of cooperative problems solving into the void ahead of the advancing probes, a gesture dismissed by many as naive, yet consistent with a species that insisted on exhausting understanding before embracing destruction. And when the first response came, it was not a greeting but an adjustment, the probes altering course minutely to avoid populated systems, a change so subtle it was almost missed. And this small deviation sparked fierce debate. Was it coincidence, optimization, or comprehension? And humanity treated it as the latter until proven otherwise, scaling up communication efforts while simultaneously preparing defensive contingencies that were far more extreme than anything revealed during the compact war. Because the truth finally shared with Allied leaders was that humanity had always known it was not alone even beyond the galaxy, and had quietly planned for scenarios where restraint might not be reciprocated. And this disclosure did not inspire fear so much as grim respect. because it framed humanity's past actions not as improvisation but as part of a long continuum of preparation guided by memory, and as months passed the extragalactic advance slowed. Measurably, probe behavior shifting from consumption to observation, and for the first time in known history the galaxy watched a potential existential threat hesitate, and while no one declared victory, the atmosphere changed, because humanity had once again demonstrated the defining pattern forged in its Great War, that power was to be revealed only when understanding failed, and even then with precision rather than excess. And as joint observation stations were established in interspecies, crews worked side by side, a new narrative began to take shape, one that traced its roots directly back to the war that had defined humanity, a war that taught them not merely how to fight but when not to. And in this emerging era, the lesson resonated more clearly than ever, that survival on a galactic scale required more than strength. It required memory disciplined enough to guide restraint even when the unknown pressed close, and the temptation to strike first whispered from every shadow. Among the stars, the final chapter of the war's legacy unfolded not with a climactic battle, but with a decision that echoed farther than any explosion ever could, because as the extragalactic intelligence continued its slow, deliberate observation, humanity reached a conclusion that had been forming since the first silent probe altered its course, that this was not an enemy to be defeated in the traditional sense, but a force to be defined against, and in a historic assembly held simultaneously across human, worlds, and allied systems, humanity proposed something unprecedented, the establishment of a standing galactic doctrine not of mutual defense alone, but of mutual restraint, a framework built around shared thresholds, agreed lines that when crossed would justify unified action, and until then would prioritize communication, adaptation, and containment over annihilation, a proposal met first with skepticism, then debate, and finally acceptance as species after species recognized that no single civilization, not even humanity, should carry the burden of final judgment alone, and this doctrine, later called the Continuance Accord, became the true endpoint of the war that had defined humanity, because it codified the lesson learned through unimaginable costs, that unchecked power, even wielded with good intent, would eventually demand a price no one could afford, and as the Accord took effect humanity did something few expected. It dismantled portions of its most devastating contingency, systems under joint oversight, not because it had grown weak, but because it trusted memory over fear, a gesture that cemented its role not as ruler of the galaxy, but as its reluctant anchor, and over time the extragalactic presence stabilized into something resembling coexistence, its expansion slowing to a negotiated boundary informed by the same mathematical language humanity had first broadcast. And though no one claimed friendship, survival was achieved without repeating the mistakes of the past. And generations later, when students across multiple species studied a conflict that reshaped galactic history, they did not focus on fleet tonnage or casualty numbers, but on a single recurring observation recorded by historians, that humanity's defining war was not the moment it proved it could destroy its enemies, but the moment it proved it could stop itself, and in that restraint the galaxy found its balance, carrying forward the quiet understanding that some civilizations are forged, not by the wars they win, but by the ones that teach them who they must never become.